One thing I want to go over right now really quickly is how to make sounds using VCV Rack. One thing about VCV Rack is that it is a modeling of a classic analog synthesizer. And one of the differences between working with an analog synthesizer and working with software like Adobe Audition is that with Adobe Audition, you're creating waveforms or blasts of white noise and using filters and sculptural tools to shape them into something that you want. But with VCV Rack or any modular system, you might consider the analogy of a potter's wheel. The sound is happening. You're hearing it as you shape it. It's not like you're gluing or putting together different elements and assembling things in editorial time, but more like you're shaping sound in real time. And it's a very, very fundamental and important difference. But to get started, let me show you some very simple procedures in VCV Rack. So what we're looking at right now is an empty rack. There are no modules. But to create a module, you hold down the control key and you click. And that calls up a library of modules. And there are many, many more modules than that. Let me show you what I mean. If you click Browse VCV Library, it opens up a web page. And in that web page, you can see that they're endless. People are continuously creating new modules that work within the VCV Rack software paradigm. So it's pretty remarkable. And each one of these is a module that you can select and place into your empty rack. Most of them are free, some of them are not, and you can see that they just go on and on and on. So it's a world to explore. But I'm going to get rid of that for now and go back to VCV Rack and hold on the control key. And these are the modules that come with the download of the software, the silver colored ones. The black ones are ones that I've downloaded and have experimented with myself from the website I showed you a moment ago. But the silver ones are the very basic building blocks, so that if you were able to go out and purchase an ARP 2500 synthesizer or a Moog modular synthesizer, these would be the kinds of modules that you would find that are part of the standard toolkit of that synthesizer. And so I'm going to start with a VCO. VCO stands for voltage control oscillator. And I'm going to add to that a audio output, which is down here. You can see there are 16 channel outputs, 8 channel outputs, but I'm going to just keep it simple and use a 2-channel output. Now, in VCV Rack, the convention is normally that an output is in a black square and an input is not. So these outputs or these jacks or these ports are outputs and these are inputs. On the audio module, these are outputs, these are inputs. So you can see that my VCO, my voltage control oscillator, can output 4 different kinds of waveforms. And to get sound out of this is nothing more than take the output of my VCO and plug it into the input of my audio module. It says here no device because my audio module is not sending to any particular output channel at the moment. If I double click on that, you see that I can route that device to my speakers. I can route it to Soundflower, and that device can also function as an input as well. You can hear the sound of the output of my VCO, my voltage control oscillator. It's feeding the left channel of my audio module. You can normally take the output of a module and feed it to multiple destinations. So I'm going to now patch a cable to send it to my right channel as well. You probably can't hear that difference from where you are, but it's now sending to both left and right channels. I can also demonstrate how my voltage control oscillator outputs not only sine waves, but triangle waves, sometimes called sawtooth waves. You can hear the difference in timbre. Again, here's my frequency control. Okay. Also sawtooth waves. Very buzzy, a lot of upper frequency harmonics. And these differences in timbre are part of the building blocks or tools of working with modular synthesis. And finally, square waves. A different assortment of upper frequency harmonics. Okay, I'm going to move this over. I'm going to hold down the control key, and I'm going to call up a filter module, a voltage control filter module. Now, my filter module can function as a low-pass filter and allow only low frequencies to pass as you roll off or attenuate the upper frequencies, or the reverse of that, allowing only high frequencies to pass as you roll off or attenuate low frequencies. In either case, if I take a harmonically rich waveform, like let's say a sawtooth wave, and patch it into the input of my filter, and take the output, let's say low-pass filter output, and patch it into my audio module, what you have is a filtered sawtooth wave oscillator. Again, I can do the same thing with any of the waveforms that my VCO can put out. Now this filter is a resonant low-pass filter, so that means that I can introduce a bump or increase of frequencies at the filter cutoff point, and I can make that bump so pronounced that it produces an oscillation in itself. Which is just a cool, beautiful, classic analog synthesis effect. But again, I want to emphasize the fact that what I'm doing in real time. I'm hearing the results not after I hit the return key, but as I'm doing it. Shaping the sound in real time, like playing a musical instrument. When you play a guitar, you don't pluck a string and wait for the result. The result is immediate. It's in real time. If I turn the resonance all the way up, I get an increased presence in that resonant bump. If I turn the drive, I can fade between only the resonant bump, that high harmonic, or both combined. So all of these things are part of the timbre shaping process that happens when you work with modular synthesis. Turn this down. Now, so far, everything that I'm doing through manual control. But someone asked in class, and it's a good question, when you say voltage control, what does that mean? What it means is that you can manually adjust a parameter of a module, or you can use the output of another parameter to make those adjustments for you. And when you do that, you're practicing modulation, using one thing to change some parameter in another thing. So if I go into Control Click and call up an LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. And what that means is the output of an LFO, unless you turn it all the way to the right, is usually subsonic, lower than the audible range. Let's see if that's true. I'm going to take the output, my sine wave output of my LFO, and I'll patch it into my module. Now, if you notice, directly to the right of the knob as I'm adjusting it, you see an output that shows you the frequency output. That's really important. because you can see specifically what frequency your module is sending. And so right now, my LFO is sending at a frequency of 1 hertz, 1.255 hertz, right? That means 1 pulse per second. That's lower than what we will hear as a continuous signal. It's only when I bring it up to around all the way over to the right where we begin to hear it. There it is at 100 hertz. So a low frequency oscillator is, as the name suggests, an oscillator that sends low frequencies. And the reason for that is those low frequencies can be really useful in modulating some parameter in a module. So I'm going to take my VCO, which is feeding my VCF, patch it back into my audio module, and I'm going to take, let's say, the sine wave output of my LFO and plug it into the frequency modulation input of my VCO. So you can hear the output of my low frequency oscillator modulating the frequency of my voltage control oscillator through voltage control, or virtual voltage control. In the days of modular analog physical synthesis, those voltages were real, they were measurable. This control allows me to, the one that I'm moving right now, FM, allows me to determine the range of modulation. Just how influential is this LFO on the frequency output of my VCO? You can see all the way up. It becomes a source of additional harmonics. So the use of a single oscillator outputting a square wave filtered through a filter using an LFO singing at quite a high frequency, I'm creating a really complex waveform. The Yamaha company patented this form of synthesis, frequency modulation synthesis, and introduced the Yamaha DX7, which was one of the best-selling synthesizers of all time, because you can get so many complex waveforms with very, very modest synthesis horsepower. 2 oscillators and deeply complex waveforms. Okay, I'm going to do one more thing, then I'll call it a day. Let's go back. Let me move this over a little bit. And let me do control. And I'm going to call up a sequencer. Now, a sequencer is, as the name suggests, a source of a sequence of control voltages. In this case, 3 rows, each row 8 steps long. You can see the outputs here. Control voltage 1, control voltage 2, control voltage 3. Each one is associated with the row of pots that I'm scrolling across here. And so the output of this row of pots would be found right here, CV1, the first row. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to patch it into this volt per octave input on my VCO. Now, volt per octave was an early form of standardization to allow for modules from one system to communicate with modules from another system, sort of like a precursor to MIDI. And what it meant in physical terms was that an increase of 1 volt would modulate the output of an oscillator by 1 octave. So I'm going to see if that works. I'm going to hit run on my sequencer, which will begin my sequencer stepping from one stage to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, outputting the control voltages that I'll dial in with the faders here. Let me turn my FM down here. You can see this little clock indicator is showing how my sequencer is stepping from stage to stage to stage to stage. And because I'm doing such a frequency modulation on my VCO by way of my LFO, I'm getting a lot of enharmonic overtones. If I bring that down, let me change this so that I'm getting no FM at all. Okay, so now I've got a sequencer controlling the frequency output of my VCO, which is still feeding my filter. I can control the tempo of my sequencer. I can control the number of steps. Right now it's going through 8 steps, but I can change that and make it go through any number, about a sequencer of 4 steps. I can make it go really fast. I can sweep my filter. Oh, sorry, I'm sweeping my VCO output on frequency. So that although the modulation is still coming from my sequencer, I can also set a sort of a master frequency and transpose the whole thing up or down. Finally, there's my filter module. Let me crank up the resonance. The classic sound of an analog sequencer driving an analog oscillator. Let me get rid of my LFO, I'm not using it at the moment, and let me do one last little experiment before I say enough for now. Let me duplicate my sequencer, and I'll bring it down in this rack space below. Let me duplicate my VCO and do the same. And let me duplicate my VCF and do the same and bring it in here. I'm going to patch them together in the same way. Here comes my VC control voltage number 1, and I'll patch it into my volt per octave input. Here comes my square wave going into the input of my filter, and let me take this out of the right channel and patch this there instead. So now I've got 2 networks that are identical, feeding both the left channel on one hand and the right channel on the other hand. If I start them at the same time, they'll start stepping through their sequence stages and playing. But because I started them not at the same time, they're both playing but slightly out of phase, which is kind of an interesting effect. Almost like a delay line. They don't have to be identical. Let me change my sequence of control voltages on my lower one. Let me bring the filter down on this one. They don't have to be the same tempo. Let me set this one to be slower than the one above. Let me bring the resonance down. Now what I'm doing is essentially making a very, very simple generative system. And I want to talk a lot about generative systems when we get together on Thursday. But all in this case that means is that even though this is a relatively simple network of modules, they're running under their own clocks. They're out of sync. And so they're not going to come together into unison anytime soon, if ever, which gives me an unfolding of combinations of pitches that is not entirely predictable, not entirely determinate, and happening on its own. I'm playing this instrument by adjusting its parameters as it plays itself. Let me change the number of steps here, which creates a really complex rhythmic relationship, because this one has 5 steps and this one has 4. So a sequence of 5 against 4. It's endless, the kinds of musical and sonic experiments that you can conduct in a system like this. I'll fade this out. So I just want to mention before I stop that the modules that we're using right now are all creating sound on their own. They're not sending out MIDI information. I'm not controlling Ableton Live or GarageBand or anything like that, but I can. Right? There are modules in VCV Rack that are MIDI modules, MIDI to CV, MIDI to control, continuous controller CV, MIDI and gate, MIDI map, CV and MIDI, CV to MIDI. So you can use a combination of synthesis modules that work independently of anything else in VCV Rack in combination with other software, and use the modules of VCV Rack to generate MIDI information as well, which expands the possibilities even more enormously. So let me say that's enough for now and call it a day. Look forward to class on Thursday, and I'll see you then.